Hey folks, welcome back to Dub Africa. And on the announcement of a $3.5 billion compensation package for dispossessed commercial white farmers in Zimbabwe, perhaps it's time to take a look back at some of the victims of the thugocracy of ZANU-PF in Zimbabwe and what happened beginning 20 years ago in the commercial farming sector in Zimbabwe. A time fraught with danger and terror for those who lived in Zimbabwe, white and black. First, let's talk about Mike Campbell. Mike Campbell's family arrived in Africa in 1713 and had been farmers on the continent ever since then. Mike Campbell, who passed away in the year 2011 at the age of 78 prematurely after suffering abuse and being tortured a couple years prior by ZANU-PF thugs who kidnapped him and his wife Angela and his son-in-law Ben Freeth. Now, Mike Campbell purchased a farm in 1980 after majority rule in Zimbabwe, after ZANU-PF came to power. The agreement at the Lancaster House was that land would be purchased on a willing seller, willing buyer basis, with the government of Zimbabwe having first right of refusal to any land. And the British government agreed to provide compensation to help Zimbabwe purchase land from commercial farmers to distribute to war veterans and poor black Africans. Now, between 1980 and 1993, roughly, the British government gave somewhere in the order of 63 billion British pounds, a princely sum back in those days, to Harare and to ZANU and later ZANU-PF. Where did that money go, ladies and gentlemen? Did it relocate poor black Africans or war veterans and put them on commercial farmland? No, in fact, it didn't. Those farms that were purchased with that money went to the likes of Robert Mugabe, members of his family, Constantine Chiwenga, Solomon Mujuru, Sharon Spiri, and a host of other senior security services, intelligence services, and ZANU-PF cadre, not to poor black Africans. So the government of ZANU-PF was never serious about land reform in Zimbabwe, simply about enriching itself. In fact, often overlooked by ZANU-PF, by Harare, by Pretoria, and the ANC government in South Africa, which gave cover and allowed the land thefts to continue while it looked the other way as millions of Zimbabweans fled to South Africa. The government of Thabo Mbeki did nothing to alleviate the situation. Nor did Nelson Mandela use his voice to end the nonsense. But between 1980 and the year 2000, 42% of all commercial farmland in Zimbabwe was sold at least one time. Often parcels of land were sold more than once, and every single time the government of Zimbabwe, majority rule government, had first right of refusal to all farmland. So any farmland sold after 1980 can never be considered as part of this myth that Robert Gabriel Mugabe spread for decades that the land had been stolen from black Africans. Yes, there was an invasion by European settlers, and columns did move up into Zimbabwe after 1890, and land was captured as a result of conquest. That's all true. But from 1980 onwards, the government of Zimbabwe, led by Mugabe, had control over all land sales. And had they been serious about land, could have returned at least nearly half of the commercial farmland to black Africans. But they weren't serious about it, and they never tried. As a consequence, thousands of commercial farming families were destroyed, impoverished, made destitute. Many people lost their lives. People like David Stevens, who was murdered at the age of 47 after brutal torture by ZANU-PF thugs on April 15th of 2000 in the first extrajudicial murder of a commercial farmer in this era. He'd been accused of supporting the opposition movement for democratic change, and as a consequence, his punishment was to be tortured brutally and his farm stolen. The foreman on his farm, the black foreman Julius Andoche, was also murdered, but his body was only found a week later after Stevens had been tortured and murdered. And the death of Martin Olds, who called for the police, who actually stopped an ambulance for coming to rescue the man who was wounded as he was trapped in his home, firebombed, shot at, Molotov cocktails thrown at him, and he died in his tub trying to survive on his farm. Fortunately, he'd evacuated his family prior to this, while the government was complicit in the murder. His neighbor tried to get there, was overwhelmed by gunfire, and had to retreat. And the senseless murder of Martin Olds, who was just 44 years old in 2000 when he was murdered by the regime's thugs. Mike Campbell, his wife Angela, and Ben Freeth, as I mentioned, were kidnapped in November of 2008. The then 75-year-old Campbell was brutally tortured. He had extensive head trauma, cracked ribs, severe injuries to his lower legs after the soles of his feet had been beaten by the regime thugs. Ben Freeth's skull was fractured in this attack. Now, some farmers didn't suffer these horrible fates or lose their lives, but dozens of commercial farmers and their spouses were murdered on the farms in this violent spree, sanctioned by the government of Zimbabwe, which now offers compensation to the victims and their descendants. In addition to the commercial farmers who were murdered, hundreds of black farm workers and foremen who lived on these farms were also tortured and murdered by these thugs. Virtually none of these cases have ever been brought to account. Thousands of Movement for Democratic Change political operatives, party members, candidates for office were made to disappear, were tortured, or murdered during this time frame. The compensation that's being offered, $3.5 billion, pales in comparison to the genuine compensation for the victims of ZANU-PF's atrocities. The Commercial Farmers Union estimates that actual compensation is somewhere in the order of $9 billion US. $3.5 billion is a far cry from that. Now, of course, in 2013, Zimbabwe amended its constitution, which required the government to compensate those whose property was expropriated, but not for the property, not the land, only for improvements and physical, tangible property on the farmland, not the farmland itself. Hence the difference between the $9 billion, which the Commercial Farmers Union says is the proper amount, and the $3.5 billion now being offered. Now, this is an amazing figure, an historic day if, in fact, ZANU-PF can come up with this money, but it doesn't have any money. Zimbabwe is bankrupt. Absolutely bankrupt. So what happens now, ladies and gentlemen? Will the government of Zimbabwe apologize? No. Will the government of Zimbabwe actually make good on this compensation? I wouldn't hold my breath. You'll simply turn blue. Here we are 2 decades after the violent seizures of land in a country where white Zimbabweans remained, adhered to the rule of law, contributed to society, built a society, purchased land, improved the land, farmed the land for 2 decades until there was nothing left for ZANU-PF to steal from the rest of the economy, and it came for the commercial farming sector, in part because Mugabe's fragile ego was disturbed by the fact that some commercial farmers, tired of being forced to sell their products at below market prices to the Grain Marketing Board and sell at a loss, while officials took that grain and sold it on the open market for a profit and pocketed the differences, impoverishing commercial farmers. Some of them finally had enough and thought they actually lived in a democracy. And so they supported, some of them, the Movement for Democratic Change. And that betrayal was one that Robert Gabriel Mugabe could not forgive. You see, he had been magnanimous. I allowed you to stay. Look how you repay me. Almost a verbatim quote. So 2 decades after this senseless violence began and the wanton destruction of the commercial farming sector in Zimbabwe, a country now perennially hungry, mired in debt, a currency that was obliterated by inflation, reverted to a dollar rand-based economy, and now is trying to issue its own money again, this is where we find ourselves today, a desperate ZANU-PF looking for foreign recognition and for foreign support for compensation. But as we approach this day, let's hope that this compensation is forthcoming. In the meantime, let's not forget all of those who died in this violent situation. Wholly unnecessary, entirely race-based, and sad. A tragic chapter in the history of Zimbabwe. A country full of wonderful human beings, many of whom have had to flee the country, at least 4 million of whom, 2.5 million living in South Africa, others living in the United Kingdom, the United States, and around the world, unable to return to Zimbabwe. Ladies and gentlemen, if you found this video interesting or compelling, or perhaps thought-provoking, and you're not a subscriber to Indaba Africa, I ask that you go ahead and smash that subscription button right down there. It costs absolutely nothing to be a subscriber to the channel. And if you've got comments, I welcome the comments. Please, if you have abusive ones, take that elsewhere. But if you've got constructive comments, whether you agree or disagree with things in this video, please feel free to add that. And then finally, I ask that you smash the like button down there because likes drive viewership. The more likes as a percentage of views for this video, the more likely it is that this video will be promoted by YouTube so that others can see it. I thank you for your time, for your patronage, and your patience on this topic.